I hope the sound is clear. Is it distorting at the back? Can you hear me clearly? Yeah. You can, very good. Look, let's just plunge straight in. 6 weeks after the fall of the Soviet Union, Deng Xiaoping went on his famous southern tour, and he told Chinese cadres in Shenzhen that the message was unambiguous. Communism and socialism, as thought about and conceived in the 20th century, was stone dead. The future was the socialist market economy. And I think that the European left has been bewildered ever since. There's been two reactions to what took place then. One is to say, on the liberal left, we will basically accept where capitalism takes us, and we will try to spend the growth dividend that it delivers as best we can to mitigate the risk for ordinary working people, except when capitalism shows itself to be as dysfunctional as it was in 2008, you are left looking like suckers. And then you try to change course, a bit like when New Labour got itself. Or you can say, like large parts of the European left, we're going to stand by our social democratic institutions, come what may. Capitalism will do what it will do. And as capitalism shows its, and I use this word advisedly, its genius and moves everything on as it definitionally and necessarily will, it's in its DNA, you simply look bewildered and left behind, protecting institutions that are now defunct. And the liberal left finds itself without a voice. It has to have an attitude to and a critique of capitalism, or it has absolutely nothing to say. Its electorate fragments, and it finds itself where the European left is in 2011. And I submit that the something to say is that the left acknowledges its Enlightenment roots and says that it is going to hold truth to power. It is going to play an Enlightenment role with an Enlightenment tradition to contemporary capitalism, and it can differentiate between good and bad capitalism. A good capitalism, which is the capitalism of the insurgent against the incumbent, that embodies the new, that recognizes that capitalism is a social construct, that organizations are social in their organization, must enlist the enthusiasms and passions of ordinary men and women if they're to drive forward. Open innovators, not closed innovators. Enfranchising workforces. This good capitalism delivers the goods. And it is the handmaiden of social mobility and the good society. A bad capitalism is a capitalism of the incumbent, a capitalism of the racketeer, a capitalism of the insider, a capitalism of the monopolist, a capitalism which tries to protect old technologies and old franchises and use politics to do whatever it can to actually defend what it has got. And in all capitalisms, there's a tension between two. There's never a capitalism where there's only good capitalism. But you can see that, as I said in my paper, that in all our societies, these forces are at work. And I would argue that in the United States, bad capitalism is driving out good, and we're watching that take place at present. The political philosophy and value system that underpins liberal social democrats as they argue for a good capitalism is the case for fairness. Now, fairness is much more than apple pie and motherhood. And if any of you do read Them and Us, if you read only 2 chapters, please read chapters 2 and 3, where I try to think through what fairness means from first foundations. Fairness, we now know, not just from a priori reflections of moral philosophy, but also from behavioral psychologists and myriads of laboratory and experimental questions to human beings in real-life situations, that every human being alive relates their formulation of their intentions to their outcomes. As babies, you know that as you formulate an intention which has a good outcome, you expect a proportionate reward from your mother or father. And if you formulate something bad, it should be proportionate. You expect the fairness of the punishment. It's why all civilizations express justice as scales, calibrating the penalty to the intensity of the crime. Proportionality and relationship between intention and outcome is one fundamental attribute of fairness. You can have libertarian fairnesses, I eat what I kill, Darwinian fairnesses. You can have more egalitarian fairnesses. But the commonsensical fairness that most people in most Western democracies adhere to is that, yes, you should get some proportional relationship between what you put in and what you get out. Your contribution should be related to your input proportionately. It's why people get so offended by bankers' bonuses. It's the proportionality that is so offensive, related to a contribution which people think is not very valuable. It's unfair, it's visceral, it gets to people's guts. That's why there's, across all our societies, there's such a big reaction to disproportionate, unearned bank bonuses and remunerations. It's unfair. But fairness is more than this. Fairness is also about something that it's about the distribution of luck. Everyone knows that life science, that we're all dealt cards, birth, beauty, in cleverness, intelligence, sportsmanlike abilities. And if we work hard on them and they're great and they produce good results, that's fair. What's unfair is luck that we have done nothing to deserve. Brute good luck, inheritance, brute bad luck, being dealt the wrong genes and getting a cancer through nothing that you ever deserved. And this is a fundamental reason why I think societies come together, for example, to organize the national a health service, a social health service. In this room, there are 100 people. 8% of the women in this room will have the breast cancer gene. Slightly more of the men in this room will have the prostate cancer gene. We don't know who's got it. It makes sense to pool our resources to protect each other against brute bad luck. Health services in this sense are not socialist or collectivist. They speak to a much more fundamental human instinct, the need to protect each other against brute bad luck. It's also why in every society there's always been a levy on the transfer of assets from one generation to another. You did nothing to deserve the wealth that you got. If you inherited it, you were just lucky, the brute good luck to come from the right genes, from the right loins. An inheritance tax is not a death tax, as it's characterized by the American right. It's a we share in your good luck tax. And last but not least, fairness is about process. We want impartiality. We want voice. Democracy is a fairness process. A court is a fairness process. Workplace representation and voice at work are fundamental processes associated with fairness. Put this together, proportionality, due desert, protecting against brute bad luck, sharing in brute good luck, and acknowledging the importance of process. And you have a value system that permits the liberal left to say, this is our value system. This is how we're going to hold capitalism's feet to the fire. This is how we're going to get a good capitalism. Any capitalist knows that actually, as he or she starts a business or starts a new project, that brute bad luck may take the whole enterprise from beneath their feet. They know the future is unknowable. They face elemental risk, what Donald Rumsfeld famously called unknown unknowns. If we want a good capitalism to embrace the unknowable new, to experiment, to discover, we have to help the entrepreneur and the company mitigate the risk they face. Hence the case for building publicly initiated a web of institutions, para-public institutions that support enterprise, and actually for being vigilant about making certain that the entrepreneur isn't tempted to do bad capitalism, There's nothing in capitalism's genes that means it will risk and innovate. These are profit seekers. And unless one sets the rules of the game so the incentives are to do good capitalism, we'll get bad capitalism, which is what we witnessed in the financial system in the last 20 years, when, led by the United States of America and followed slavishly by London, we permitted the banking system to grow its balance sheets to ridiculous levels, believing they had solved the alchemy of risk with less and less capital underpinning it all, with the disaster that we all lived through. Bad capitalism. It means that there's a raft of things that one has to do to ensure good capitalism. Ownership structures, financing structures, investment in universities and technology transfer, skills formation, keeping markets open, vigilant competition policy, a network of intermediate institutions initiated by the public agency, and necessarily the handmaiden of good capitalism. There is a codependency between public and private, and this will generate enormous churn. The average lifespan of an S&P 500 company is now 12 years, down from 45 years, 50 years ago. It will fall again. All our societies are going to see extraordinary churn, companies rising, growing, and then either being taken over or just collapsing. It is going to be a much riskier society. But get good capitalism right, and actually this churn can also be the handmaiden of something else extraordinarily important, social mobility. Social mobility flows from a good capitalism and supports it. It is, in fact, a self-reinforcing mechanism. But to help individual, ordinary men and women navigate the additional risk in our societies, we have to give them the assets with which to support the risk they face, and we have to redesign our welfare systems, why I'm so enthusiastic about flexicurity. This does mean action by the state, a state which is discredited and when it taxes, citizens are so suspicious. The opinion poll at the front of the paper's memos to the left exhibits those results. We have to think about how we attempt to legitimize public action. I did a review of fair pay for the coalition government. I don't think for a second they're going to implement it. I want to see them monitoring the ratios of top pay to median pay. I want targets set by remuneration committees on which trade unionists are members. And if the people leading organizations in the public sector do not achieve those targets, then they should be on an earn-back relationship to earn back some of their basic pay. And if they do very, very well and overachieve, only then can they get additional upward bonuses. It's an attempt to introduce a performance culture into the British public sector, and actually to throw a challenge down to the private sector, and indeed CEOs and bankers in particular, that their remuneration only goes up. They never have to earn their bonuses. They never put their base pay at risk. Nobody and no worker, no employee, who are often know more about the organization actually than the notables on the remuneration committee and know the real life challenges, are playing a part in the formulation of the objectives by which this individual will be judged and his or her team. Ideas like that have got to be deployed to re-legitimize, in my view, public activity, the public activity and the public initiative, which will lay the foundations for the flexicurity, the education, and all the network of institutions to support a good capitalism. I finish by saying this. I think these ideas of fairness, due desert, with all that implies for individual responsibility. If you do well, you get proportionately better paid. If you do badly, you don't. Exactly the message that Marx spelt to the French socialists in the 1840s when he critiqued the Gotha program. The social democracy in it, which is about the need to take collective and social and public action to mitigate brute and bad luck. Liberal social democracy, in this sense, appealing to equity, appealing to the people's deep sense that actually they should get their due deserts, good or bad, is the liberal part of this equation. The social democratic part of it is about our interventions to act in the face of brute good and brute bad luck. It generates a fabulous new language. inheritance tax being a we share in your good luck tax, a rhetoric that I think can take on the right. It also permits the liberal left in Europe to speak to those members of the financial community and the wider business class who actually want to do good capitalism, and there are a great deal of them. This permits the European liberal left to form a governing coalition, in my view, and actually to do a good capitalism and to deliver to ordinary men and women. Thank you very much.
That's a lot to chew on. Three of our leaders are struggling in opposition, so I'm going to start with Anna, who's struggling in power and in office with perhaps the most miserable fiscal circumstances. Will talked about luck. You had the luck to come in to office just as the Greek economy went over the falls. Can you actually talk to voters at all about the path forward with a program that gives people hope when you're administering so much pain? Tell us what's going on now, and what's the argument?
I would like to start with something personal. I am in the Social Party since I was 17 years old. And I followed through its development at the national and the socialist and the European level. And now I am a member of a government who, at this juncture, has to answer to a question, allow me the rhetorical expression, to answer to the question for life or death, and I don't exaggerate. When you have to answer to this question, the ideological margins are very narrow. And I could say that the ideological options, ideological choices, do not exist. So it is decisions who have to be taken with no time. We have to take decisions for life or death every day. And it is only the results which will prove if they are good or bad, successful or unsuccessful. The financial crisis in Greece exposed the Greek government's deficiency to exercise an efficient economy. And now in 18 months, in 12 months, because normally we started last May, we had to put in place what we haven't done in 30 years. And it is true that it was an irreasonable economy and a faux-fair society. And this is mainly why we have this crisis to this extent. In these 12 months, we had to tackle four different kinds of crises. It was the financial crisis, it was a competitiveness crisis, a crisis of credibility, and a crisis of principles and values. We had to deal with the three of them immediately, but you can imagine that the most difficult and the most complicated one is the last one. And there we have to come back to basic values of our society, of our people, and of our party. In the three other fields, we have proceeded with many, many reforms. Just to give you an idea and to see what is responsible and what not, because we have to put in place, to put in the pipeline and to implement all these reforms in order to have a responsible society, a responsible economy, and a fair society. But in this transitional period, I'm afraid that we have not responsible always economies and not fair solutions. To give you some ideas, an idea of what we have done. In 1 year, we have reduced the deficit for 6 points. There is no other paradigm at the European level. We reformed the taxation system, particularly we tackled with tax evasion, which is one of the major issues of the country. But of course, I must be sincere, we do not have results because it is a structural problem. It's a problem of structures, but it's a problem of culture as well, and we cannot change the culture in 1 year or in 12 months. Then there is a series of reforms. There are some dozens of reforms. For example, we have already changed the administration of the country from 1,000 municipalities. Now we have 350, and it has been implemented. Now they do work, 350 municipalities. We had the most radical reform in the pension system. In 3 months' time, we had a reform that changed everything in the pension system. Many other things, and just to give you an idea, in my portfolio, which is a very sensitive one, the Minister of Education and Research and Technology, and I had to work in 2 different directions. One, the policies to reform primary, secondary, higher education. Nothing is easy on these things. On the other side, I had to rationalize the system. So we closed down 2,000 school units. We closed down 25 technological institution departments. These are very difficult decisions, and it is more difficult to be implemented. And you can imagine that there is a shock not only in the public opinion, but a shock in our party. I mean, it is very difficult for the party and sometimes for the majority of the members of the parliament to understand and to accept the need and the speed we have to work with. What kind of optimism I could find here? It is people, we can feel in the people a sense of rage, of course. But at the same time, a sense of self-awareness. And people sometimes are beyond the political system, are beyond the politicians. People can understand, and we can see it in the polls, can understand the need of changes and reforms, and they can change that. We have to do it immediately. Not always the political system. And we do not have consensus. I mean, there is a fight again among the parties. But this is what we believe, that people can feel, can understand it. Now, since all these are in the pipeline and there are results in some reforms, there are not results in others, we had at the same time to tackle with the general finances crisis, with financial crisis, which has to do with the banking system and with the financial sector itself. And here I would like to make a comment with the links with the international, European and national crisis and the responsible economy. We had a support of 110 billion euros through the mechanism of the European Union, which is a huge amount of money. And at the same time, we had to give guarantees of about 100 billion for the banks. So this is one of the major issues. And I think, I have to, maybe we can continue with the questions, that when we speak about a responsible economy, we are obliged to understand and to see that in this particular juncture, one main reason of the crisis is that governments and oversight mechanisms were not responsible for functioning which were outside the realm of legitimacy. And it is these governments who are responsible now or are blackmailed to save the sectoral, the financial sector, although sometimes it is very difficult for them in order to protect people. So, in a nutshell, to have a responsible economy at a national level, we need other kind of institutions and rules at the European and international level. And this is one of the main challenges that we have for the time being, not only at the European Union, but between European Union and the United States.
Well, the opposition may be feeling better these days, or being in opposition. Ed, let me turn to you. You claimed the mantle of optimism in your acceptance speech for the Labour Party in the UK, but you built your argument around freedom and opportunity rather than on fairness. Is there a difference between an argument about opportunity and an argument about fairness? How do you respond to Will in that regard?
Well, I think Will's talk was very compelling, and let me just say that I very much welcome Policy Network bringing European leaders, our colleagues from America, together at this event and at subsequent events. Let me just say three brief things, John, maybe just to help inform the discussion about what general lessons I think we should be learning about the European left. I think the first is that we need, in the tradition of Policy Network, to keep being modernizers. I want to say something briefly about what I mean by that and what the British experience is in relation to that. Secondly, and it speaks to your question to me, we need to be people who reassure on a lot of the key issues that we face. And again, I'll say something about that in the British context, but we also need to be the people who are bearers of the future. Because unless we are that as political parties, we definitely won't succeed. And then thirdly, and maybe slightly more controversially, it's clearly right to say that we should not be overconfident about the position of European social democracy. And I don't think there's any danger of that talking to people at this gathering. I think we should also avoid the... I think we should also avoid the other danger, which is excessive pessimism about our situation. And I promise you I'll be brief, because I know we're supposed to only talk for 5 minutes. I'll be as brief as I can just to say something about those issues. But first of all, on old orthodoxies come from left and right, if you like, and we have to avoid both of them. And I mean, Will had not so much a dig at New Labour, but a sort of factual statement of the position, which is that we had too benign a view of markets. And we had too benign a view of markets in a number of respects, in relation to, obviously, the financial crisis, in relation to some issues like around free movement of people within Europe and some of the implications that would have, and indeed on some more local issues about the shape of local communities and the way in which the shape of local communities in Britain changed. On all those orthodoxies, I think we need to move on, not by abandoning the proper role of markets in our economy, but by understanding the traditional social democratic lesson, which is government needs to play its role in limiting the dislocating and disruptive effects of markets. And in a way, that's an old lesson of social democracy, but it's one that we are relearning after the financial crisis. On the other side of the argument, and I know Jacob Hacker talked to you earlier, and again, this is not necessarily a comment on other European countries, but it's a comment maybe partly on Britain. I think that we ended up with a tax and transfer model of social democracy. Actually, yes, there were differences about the way we ran the economy, but essentially the way we got our fairness was through redistribution, through tax and benefit system. But inequality approximately stayed the same, or maybe on some arguments went up in the United Kingdom. Well, that shows that Jacob Hacker's argument that you need, I love this phrase, pre-distribution, not just redistribution, must be right if we are to achieve our social and economic goals. So first point, we have to keep being modernizers. And it's very, very important to take a kind of clear-eyed look at what went right and what went wrong, including in this movement and our views in the 1990s. Second point, about reassurance and the future. Look, looking at the papers prepared for this session, I think there are lots of common issues that we face, although from different perspectives. Fiscal responsibility, concerns about the impact of immigration, welfare and responsibility. All of those issues are really important, and they're really important in the UK that we tackle them as well. But I'll tell you something I'm absolutely certain of, which is that if that's the only thing we do, we won't win elections. You've got to be in the future business. And this is in a way why, I'm just going to come to my third point, but this is why in a way I think we should have more optimism than sometimes people suggest. Because think about the big issues which, apart from fiscal issues, which are exposed by this crisis, and apart thinking about the UK. We have a new inequality in the UK, not just between the rich and the poor, but between the rich and everybody else. So what you've had in America for 20 or 30 years has been happening in the last 5 years in the UK and is set to continue, which is those at the top are getting the gains and the proceeds of growth, and those in the middle and on lower incomes are stuck. Now, unless you're addressing those issues as a Social Democratic Party, and frankly the Conservatives are very unlikely to address them, you're not going to meet what people want. Second point around equality. Intergenerational equality, I think, is going to be the issue of this part of the 21st century. What is the next generation going to face in all of the issues that you can think of? The environment, jobs, housing, huge issues that they face. And we've got to have an offer to that next generation because it puts us partly into the future business. That's just two illustrations of the ways in which I think that unless we are parties that speak to the future, we're not going to succeed. And then third point, just about this I get some sense of pessimism talking to folks here. Look, the position is not a good position in terms of lots of parties being out of power across Europe and those parties in power facing enormous challenges, as we just very eloquently heard. But so-called crisis of social democracy is not some new phenomenon. Throughout its history, people have been talking about the crisis of social democracy. You know, people were talking about it in the 1980s with the rise of the new right. People were talking about it in the 1930s with the issues that we faced in the 1930s. And there is something very, very important. Our opponents are strong in some ways because they have, in some countries, repositioned themselves, made themselves look more moderate, some of the things that we did in the 1990s. But they are weak in one fundamental sense, which is that their response to the crisis of neoliberalism is more neoliberalism. Now, that should give us a sense of optimism about what we can achieve. That's not to say it is somehow easy, because the experience of social democratic parties over the last few years suggests otherwise. But I suppose my final thought on this is that we as a movement have to have more of a sense of self-confidence that actually the right is not going to address the big issues that our world faces in the 21st century, from the environment to inequality to all of those things, because nothing in their philosophy will address those issues. And we've got to have some confidence that we're the people that can do it.
Thank you. I'm going to flip over and turn to try to pick up on that point and turn to Håkan, because the Conservatives have won the last two elections in Sweden by running on competence and moderation, sort of social democrats light. So to pick directly up on Ed's point, do they govern that way? And to go back to something Prime Minister Stoltenberg said this morning, can you win by being the real thing against a party that is essentially mimicking the rhetoric of social democracy?
Well, to start with, it's absolutely necessary for us to describe our vision of the future. We can never be the guards of history, and I fully agree with Ed on that, because the Conservatives all the time say that you belong to history. And I have been the party leader now for just 50 days. That's close to nothing, 50 days. But I have been so concerned that we should fill our political vision into a concrete way to describe what we want to achieve. So I had already with my national committee, my party committee, and also executive committee and the national board pointed out 3, let's say, cornerstones to our future policy. The first one is that we build our policy on value-based growth, a value-driven growth, a moral way to grow. And that's something the Conservatives have really difficulties when it comes to discuss with us, because when we link growth to values, it's hard for them to react on that. So we can never ever accept that child poverty is needed because you need growth. We say it's the opposite. If we can do measures against child poverty, that's rising today in Sweden. 220,000 kids in our country today are living in circumstances described as child poverty. That's new for Sweden. We're not used to that. And we have a situation where we can never accept that you stress out the workers, the labor force. So fewer and fewer, less and less will be able to stay at the working place until you reach retirement age. And the Conservative government discussed, well, maybe we should work until we are 70 years old. And we respond on that saying, let's start with organizing our working places in a way so we can stay there and fulfill our task and earn money until we reach the age of retirement. We call that the value-driven growth. And the second cornerstone will be a knowledge-based economy. We need to do more when it comes to invest in knowledge. Through the whole school system, of course, primary schools, secondary schools, universities, but also in-service training at the working places. And we need to do that all the time, because you know when there is time for, when everything works perfectly, then there is no time to do this in-service training. And when we are up into a depression, then there is no money to do this in-service training. So we need to have a handshake between enterprises and trade unions and the state to have an ongoing learning in-service training. And the third cornerstone that we already have challenged them on is that we want to achieve what we call a social investment policy. And the idea behind a social investment policy is the fact that we do not believe that solidarity is a burden, that solidarity is charity. We need to explain that solidarity, that we invest in each other, is a precondition for growth for everyone. And we need to be better explaining that if you have a job, your position will not be worse if an unemployed brother or sister can be raised above poverty line. And if you are well educated, your position will not be worse if a brother or sister will achieve education. So we need to challenge them on the vision of the future. We want to invest in the future. We want to use the surplus today in the Swedish economy for investment when it comes to healthcare sector, education, working places, instead of just tax cuts of today. It's an enormous richness of ideas from the conservatives, the right wings, when it comes to tax cuts, because their ambitions are lower than our ambitions. We have higher ambitions, and we called our budget, spring budget, higher ambitions for Sweden. Because if you have higher ambitions, then you're also responsible to explain the idea behind higher ambitions. We will never accept that we shrink our country into a situation where we will just be customers on a market. We want to do social investments where you have your rights as a citizen of the country. And the three cornerstones would be, as I mentioned to you, value-driven growth. They can never challenge us on that. Knowledge-based economy. They have no idea about that. And a social investment policy. And I can tell you a secret. No, not a secret now since the webcams are on, but some conservative editors has already said that the new social democratic leadership have established a new political language in Sweden, because we want to describe the vision and give tools to our politicians, our colleagues on municipal level, on regional level, on national level, to fill in the ideas of value-driven growth, knowledge-based economy, social investment policy, and say this is exactly what we can do on these three cornerstones. And then we will meet the conservatives saying, and your answer is still tax cuts. You had tax cuts when we were in a depression, and you have tax cuts now when we are in when the situation when the economy runs for full. So they have the same answer to two different questions and two different situations, and we will describe the future while telling that there could be a better country. Higher ambitions for Sweden.
Great. Yeah, we've seen not just the politics of fairness across Europe and the U.S., but the politics of division. Can the rise of the far-right parties, et cetera, the success of, at least at the margins of strong argument for division, can the politics of solidarity as Håkan described, be politically successful in your mind, in your circumstance?
Well, thank you. Maybe I start telling that in 1967, when I became member of the Labour Party in the Netherlands, it was at that time the slogan of the party was a plea for a division of power, income, and knowledge, and that attracted me very much. And looking back to that time, and now looking to the nice introduction of Will Hutton, I think that the idea of fairness is, well, so to speak, a modern version of this idea of the division of power, income, and knowledge. And I would like to elaborate this idea of fairness on what happened since 1967 and now on the one hand education, and on the other hand the labor market and the polarization on the labor market, which we are looking at, I think, in the whole of Europe and especially also in the Netherlands. And looking to what education did, I think that Social Democrats have been very successful. At the time that I had the opportunity to study, I think that was only a couple of people had the opportunity to study. And when you look now, you see that a lot of people benefited from the fact that we have all this education. And I think that it is to the benefit of all those people. At the same time, if you look now at the situation as it is now, you can see that the ongoing increase in the educational level seems to have reached its limits. And as a consequence, this, for us, important theme has lost its emancipatory working and inspiration, although it is still important. And maybe that might be one of the reasons of the discontent which we see now in our societies. I think this discontent might be also a result of the globalization, a result of migration, which makes it more difficult for people to relate to their own situation. And if you lose the perspective to improve your social economic situation or that of your children, you lose your orientation on the future and focus on your current position. And this is why a social democratic agenda must answer a new question, the question how we can improve the security and appreciation of people within their current social, economic, and job situation. So the fairness which we had and which we applied to education now brings us to a new point, how to react in a situation where so many people have this education and don't think that they can reach what they thought that they could reach. And a second and strongly latent trend which we see is the deepening of the cleavage between people with lower and higher education, and especially on the labor market, with the middle groups stuck in the middle, fearing to move down instead of up. And Social Democrats must fight cleavages that threaten to polarize society, disrupt social cohesion, and distribute chances, risks, and security unevenly. And this cleavage that polarizes our labor market exists already for a while, but is becoming deeper. And the ongoing globalization unevenly divides chances. The higher educated, they see their options increased, the world is literally their playing field, and their relative scarcity gives them access to higher wages and even more certainty than they already had. And the lower or non-educated see their options become more and more limited and the competition more and more fierce. Not only do they compete with other employees, automation and outsourcing, but now also with migrants from Eastern European countries, willing to work longer for less money. And their wages and security are under constant pressure. And this, I realize that very well, is not a new analysis. And the common discourse proposes as a solution more flexibility in the labor market and less protections for the insiders to enhance the chances of the outsiders. And hence, easy redundancy rights, shorten unemployment benefits, etc., etc. And the idea is that if fixed labor becomes more flexible, employers will have less need for flexible contracts from outsiders, and current outsiders can become insiders, and insiders who are all in flexible work now. But looking to the Dutch labor market, this is already extremely flexible. It is estimated as 1/3 of the total labor force and working on flexible contracts. These are people working in temporary contracts, freelancers, independent workers, women, the young, and migrants from Eastern Europe. And that is a very diverse group. A lot of these people choose to be independent freelancers. They enjoy being boss of their own time and job choices, and they earn enough to provide for their social security. Others, however, are forced to flexible work with little pay and no protection or social security. And therefore, talking about fairness, the question I would like to raise is the following. Is the main cleavage on the labor market between insiders and outsiders, or is it between people in lower educated jobs facing fierce competition, little pay and little security on the one side, and higher educated people on the other side, having lots of opportunities and providing for their own security, no matter if they choose to work on flexible contracts or jobs with open-ended contracts? And if the last is the case, we should accept that the people most in need of protection should we accept that those people most in need of protection get little or no security? And if the main cleavage on the Dutch labor market is the cleavage between lower educated and higher educated jobs, isn't the inside-outside discourse distracting us from what's really going on? Whole sectors of the labor market are making use of flexible, low-paid work with little or no protection or rights for social security. And here, outsiders are not kept from an open-ended contract because of the rights of insiders, but rather it's a fight between outsiders, if you still want to use that term. They are the postal workers since liberalization delivering mail for paper piece under the minimum wage. They are the workers of the agricultural business picking tomatoes paid by the basket. They are the people cleaning our offices and airports. They are the people helping our elderly in their homes. They have little or no chance to move to an open-ended contract in their lower educated sectors. And if we thus talk about fairness of capitalism, we must talk about the situation in this part of the labor market. We must discuss how to give them decent work, decent pay and protection, and the appreciation they deserve for their work. We must not fight the labor organizations here, but motivate the workers to organize themselves. And yes, we still strive for social mobility, but we must also acknowledge that not everybody can move up the ladder. And we must acknowledge that flexibility is unevenly distributed between sectors and start discussing questions related to that. For example, is it a possibility to also unevenly distribute the social protection that we give people in different sectors? And if competition is low and job wages high, maybe one needs less instead of more rights to social security than working in a job where wages are low and competition is high. Differentiation of social security along with the risks might be a manner of fairness. And that's what I thought that might be elaboration on the idea of fairness in a new manner.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to the audience in a minute, but I actually would like to stick with this theme for a second and suggest that in all developed economies, we've seen the hollowing out of middle wage, middle skilled jobs. Some of that's the result of technology and automation. Some of it's the result of wage pressure from globalization. Some of it's the result perhaps from immigration, although there was a strong case made that was not really a major driver by our friend from Chile earlier today. And our answer, I think, in the past was, since high skill, high education jobs were paying more, our answer was give people more education and more skills. And I think that what Job was suggesting is that you got to concentrate across that spectrum of having a strategy that creates middle skill jobs, bringing up wage standards and justice of jobs at the bottom, and continuing to invest in education at the top. But I wonder if people would just want to react to each other before I open things up to the floor. Does that sound right? Do we need to restructure our economy so the answer to people only isn't just go get more training, but that there's a strategy to create jobs across the spectrum of work? Ed, you want to?
Well, I do agree with that. And I think, again, just learning some lessons, I think we were better at the supply side of this than we were at the demand side, at least in the UK. And when Peter became the industry secretary, Peter Mandelson, towards the end of our time in government, he was pioneering a much more active industrial policy for our country in some of those new industries of the future, like the green industries, where actually there's going to be huge numbers of jobs created for a whole range of reasons. They could be developed world jobs, but there's a big race on to create those jobs. And so I think, we had a very bad history in Britain of industrial policy in the 1970s because we propped up some pretty failing companies. But I actually think that rethinking that industrial policy for the future is one point. Secondly, I think there is an issue, certainly for our party and maybe for other parties, are about our attitude to small business. Because actually a lot of the jobs of the future are going to come from small businesses and the self-employed. And generally, they have not been a core part of our constituency. And thinking about the service that they get, for example, from big finance, I think has to be a big part of what we talk about in the future. Now, the Conservatives, at least in Britain, talk about tax and regulation, and those are issues. But actually, one of the biggest kind of sources of anger among small businesses in Britain today is around the service they get from the banking industry. I think for us, certainly as a political party, reaching out to them as a potential source of these middle income, not so much jobs, but middle income wages or earnings, I think is an important part of the future offer.
Anna, in Greece, there's a brain drain going on from young college graduates who find no opportunity, I think.
Not so much as it is said, but it is a problem. But as far as this middle-skilled thing is concerned, according to CEDEFOP, there is a new study for all member states and for Greece as well. And it is, even in the crisis, there is an estimation that 150,000 jobs are going to be created in this middle-skilled area, but it is not something that it can be developed without a strategy, because these skills need a different strategy. And they are linked with new industries, with green industries and many other areas in the technological in the skills in the technological area. And this is why I believe that this focus of the educational system to this kind of skills, which was not the priority in the past, it's now a new need. And it has to do with technological educational development and with lifelong learning, which is one of the major priorities now at the European level and in its country.
Will, does the focus on fairness answer the question about where jobs in the developed countries are going to come from, particularly for middle skills? Does good capitalism produce good jobs, and bad capitalism, produce negative results?
Well, I think that good capitalism does create jobs. I think that people should be optimistic about this. They're going to be the innovation theorists talk about general purpose technologies, transformative technologies that really have step changes in humankind's capacity to do stuff and huge spillover effects. For example, the printing press was a general purpose technology. The motor car was a general purpose technology. The internet is a general purpose technology. And here's why I talk about it. There were 8 general purpose technologies in the 20th century. There were 4 in the 150 years beforehand. There will be between 15 and 20 of these technologies in the 21st century. The transformation in the production base is going to be just stunning. The opportunities for jobs are going to be unbelievable. What's required is the good capitalism and the codependency between public and private to take advantage of it. And I would say that there are two substantive reasons why you have the squeezed middle and disappointing job generation in the United States. One, I would say the terms of trade. I mean, you know, as China and India enter world markets, the price of foodstuffs, raw materials, and energy has just gone up, which means that actually, you know, you've got to make more dollars, more euro, for more pounds, and if any kind of working class person has to make more of that to sustain the same living standards because there's, you know, the same amount of resources being bid for and the price is going up. And the second thing is the point I made in my short presentation. I think that the United States has got less good at doing good capitalism and much. And there's too much incumbency, too little churn, and with that comes ossification. So I do think that this needs managing. You have to have the correct monetary and fiscal policies. You have to have a fit-for-purpose financial system. There's a lot for liberal social democrats to do. But, I mean, for God's sake, I mean, I can promise you in this room that in 20 years' time, 2/3 of the jobs that will be done in 2030 have not now been invented. There will be all the capacity to have close to full employment, and actually the productivity will grow, and living standards will rise as long as you get the fundamentals right. I don't buy this kind of despair.
Håkan?
Yes,
Sorry about that, but I mean, that's my view.
Yeah. Linked to that, I would like to add that fairness must also be every person's right to have a job and to support themselves, both men and women, and to be employable. Fairness is something that we can discuss when we talk about what conservatives so often call the productive and unproductive sector of the economy. And we as progressive leaders, we must be more convincing, saying that investments, social investments, are productive, not unproductive. And I want to share one figure with you, and it is the female employment rate. And as you know, in European Union, the female employment rate is only 55%, compared with more than 70% in Sweden. It's a substantial difference. The high employment rate among women in Sweden is, of course, not the Swedish habit. It's a priority by us social democrats. We have invested in nursing care, child care, care for elderly, and so on, so make everyone employable, and that's productive. So we must challenge the right wings when they come to us saying, these welfare ambitions you have, that costs too much, they are unproductive. And then we must convince them, no, it's the opposite. Doing these social investments are productive, that will create growth, that will make it possible to compete in the global economy. And we need to produce more. And it's a substantial difference, 55% compared to more than 70% in Sweden. So social welfare is not a cost. Social welfare is an investment in growth.
Excellent
and that
point.
can the conservatives never agree on.
I'm going to open things up to, well, let's start in the back. Short interventions or questions. And please identify yourself.
Thanks. Kevin Duggan, University of Bristol. Taking the good and bad ideas that Will has presented, there's also good fairness and bad fairness. In the UK, the argument about loading families with huge levels of debt to get students through university has been based on fairness to the taxpayer. The argument about pension reform in the public sector has been based upon fairness to the private sector. In America, there's something called fair accounting, which says we must reform or privatize pensions in order to be fair to the next generation. So there's good fairness and there's bad fairness. How does the left express itself differently from those who want to rationalize and legitimize fairness and promote austerity? Secondly, Will, are you not also counselling an acceptance and a tolerance of inequality through your concepts of fairness?
What was your name, sorry?
Kevin Dugan, University of Bristol.
Come on up in the front. Got a mic over here. I would note that that this argument about fairness also is closely associated with the argument about choice, and that the movement of choice to individuals is highly associated with actually moving risk onto the individual so that they bear the risk in society. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Bo Rothstein. I'm a political scientist from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. I have one question. Political scientists are interested in democracy. And one thing that we see all over the world is, of course, a huge success of democracy. When I was young, Greece, Spain, Portugal was dictatorships. Now, not only are they democracies, Latin America, we see Middle East, the Far East. And so democracy is a big hit in the world. However, there is one thing I never hear when I listen to leading social democratic politicians, and that is the idea of economic democracy, workplace democracy, or so. And the reason I'm asking is that I spent a lot of time doing research and reading research about what you can say burnout, depression, things in work life. And one thing, although I'm not in the medical profession, one thing that comes out very clearly is that one reason for this is that people feel that they are not heard, they don't have a say, nobody listens to them, they are ignored at the workplace. And this, and especially in Sweden, this has hit very much women working in the public sector. Now, are there any one of you who have any ideas about what can be done about this? Or is sort of economic democracy a thing that is not supposed to be discussed anymore?
Anybody want to react to that? Let's go here and then we'll go there.
I enjoyed very much the presentations, but I just would like to raise a question and actually make a comment. Sir? My name is Daniel Vargas. Yeah. I understand it's not the first time that social democracy is in crisis. There has been several crises. But there seems to be something different in the way we identify the nature and the solutions to this crisis. And the difference might be that we are no longer only debating it in conceptual terms, whether we should have more state or more market, or less market, or more market and less state, as if it were a hydraulic relation. You have to choose one instead of the other. And it's no longer whether we believe in social justice or in fairness or in other big words, but instead, how are we going to take the concrete initiatives to provide institutional answers for the people so that they can believe again that it's possible to change reality and to bring about those changes that we all desire. So my concern in concrete terms is this. Sometimes the debate on very abstract issues seems to camouflage, to deviate the narrow political attention from discussions on how are we going to redesign the industrial policy so that you can provide the vanguard of small and medium-sized companies with the instruments of production. How are we going to change our labor laws so that you can protect and represent the increasing number of people who are in the informal work, in the informal economy. So my concern in simple words is, it is important not to let abstract debates in politics camouflage what's more important, which is how to look for institutional solutions to the problems we are facing today.
I'm Soni Kapoor. I run the international think tank Redefine. Two quick comments. The first one, I trained initially as an engineer, and as Will pointed out, and as I think it was pointed out, almost all the wealth that our societies see now is built on real innovation, which comes from science and technology, almost all of it. And the contribution, if any, of the financial sector as an independent generator of prosperity and wealth is very limited. And what I gave as an engineer, I took away as an investment banker, having seen both sides. And this is exactly what has happened. And I think this is one of our failings thus far. We have failed to make the divide between the financial sector and the real economy, which we are actually very well placed to do. And it continues, for example, in lobbying in Brussels, in the United States, etc. You see real market economies, including SME companies, etc., lobbying on behalf of the financial sector. And we need this narrative for the people. We need the good capitalism. And the second point is that there is continuing to be this perception of a trade-off between the size of the pie and the distribution. And like it or not, but the common perception is that a fairer distribution of the pie, the softer values of solidarity, of niceness, of fairness that we embody as the center-left, are somehow less compatible with the size of the pie, that growth is somehow better in a less well-distributed equality of society. And it's after that, post-fact, that we distribute the size of the pie. And there again lies our big challenge, because that's simply not true. Much of this so-called growth we saw, as we saw in the case of Ireland, etc., was illusionary, didn't exist. When I was trading derivatives, I took out bonuses, and the person on the other side of my derivative trades also took out bonuses. $50 billion back in 2003, taken out, which didn't exist. This was all illusionary. So we need to win this narrative that these are fundamentally consistent values of solidarity, fairness, growth, and dynamism, and the other side is not.
Okay. I actually want the panel maybe to react to some of the things that have been said, and particularly this question of can we succeed as social democrats without changing that fundamental perception that was just raised. I tried to raise this in my opening comments, that growth is burdened by a fair distribution of income. Again, at least history, if not academic economics, would suggest that the opposite. Do we need to kind of tackle that question and argue for a model that more inclusive growth creates more growth, a bigger pie, and therefore the fruits of the overall economy will be not only more fairly distributed, but bigger? Ben?
Gosh, good questions. Well, I mean, yes, we do need to challenge that notion. I must say, I thought our Swedish colleague in his contribution was directly challenging that idea, because he was linking together value-driven growth with the social investment state. And, you know, it's interesting this, because if you take the British debate about higher education, and just to, sort of very briefly, you know, part of the mistake of the right in the changes that they've made is that they have withdrawn all teaching support, all public teaching support for 80% of degrees. Now, that isn't just a technocratic mistake. That says something, precisely speaking to what our Swedish colleague said, about whether we all have a shared interest in people going into higher education and we do better as a result, or whether it's simply a matter of individual marketized choice, which is what they want to tell us. So, I mean, I think you put it very well, John, and we do need to challenge that notion. I would just be very briefly deal with some of the other good questions that were asked. On Kevin's question about good fairness and bad fairness, Will want to come back on this. I think this issue, and I think what you said spoke to this, of what is the impact on the next generation is very powerful, and I'll tell you why. Because in Britain anyway, the Conservatives want to say, we are the long-termists, because we are the people who are cutting the debt. But actually, the way they're cutting the debt is by loading a massive problem on the next generation in Britain. And so the idea that that is a long-termist solution is completely wrong. It's actually a very short-termist solution, because it makes the life chances of the next generation and actually the economic prospects for the next generation significantly worse. Boo Rothstein asked a very good question, and none of us talked about it. Will Hutton did this very interesting report for the government recently, and one of the things he talked about in his report, I'm turning into his agent here, but one of the things he talked about in his report was, which was on pay differentials, was the idea of workers' representatives being on some of the boards in determining these pay representatives, the pay differentials that are paid. He may want to say something about that. Finally, on this, on the last question that was asked, I think what you said was bang on, and in a way, I think one of the things I was saying in my opening is we need to be maybe more brave in challenging some of these notions about, precisely the balance we have between financial services and other industries. And I've said, and as I think John referred to, I've said, look, we need a stronger industrial base, not just in financial services. It's a big job creator in Britain, but you need other things as well, and not just be so reliant on financial services.
Yeah, you want to react to any of this?
I would like to react on the question on the economic democracy, and I fully agree with that. And I relate it also to one of the elements of the introduction of Will, where he talked about a fair process. And I think that's very important. I think when you really give people a voice, whether it is in our democracy or in an economic democracy, in their work, I think that's very important, and not only for those people for whom it's more easy to get a voice, for example, those who are better educated, but also for those who are less educated. And I think that also for social democrats, we should neglect all those people who don't have a chance or the possibility to get an education. Or an education in which great jobs come up for them. So it's also for us very elementary and necessary to organize also this economic democracy in their jobs and in those jobs, and organizing it away together with the trade unions, to give those people a good job, and especially for those who don't have the other possibility. So I agree with you that this economic democracy is an important element, and I think that it goes well with this idea of a fair process.
Okay.
Yes, of course I agree with that, but if we should be honest, more could be done in public sector. Because public sector is, so to say, controlled by us as politicians. But all the time we return demanding on private sector to strengthen democracy at the working places. Of course, that is correct. But if we will be able in the future to have the chance to continue to be a welfare state, more students must come into the welfare sector and work there. And the welfare sector is, so to say, in Sweden so far, to a large extent, a public sector. Not to 100%, but to a large extent. And we need to be the best, to create the best working places, where you are listened to, and when you can do career steps, and where you can influence the working place. And we have so much to do there. We have not done enough. So if we should protect the public sector, the welfare state, and also strengthen the democracy at the working places, we can start by ourselves in the public sector. And that's my responsibility, and I will do that when I become Prime Minister of Sweden.
Excellent.
A comment reacting to what has been said about innovation and social investment. I would like to remind you that in 1999, when the majority of governments at the European level were social democrats, there was at that time the Lisbon Agreement, where we have agreed to a target for 2010. More or less, we had said that Europe will be the most advanced knowledge-based society and economy in the world, and we had targeted the employment rate to 3%, the unemployment rate. In this report, member states at that time and social democrat leaders, they were the vast majority at that time, had committed themselves, and each country has committed itself, in very qualitative and quantitative targets. So, employment for women, participation for women, kindergarten according to the infrastructure, issues concerning innovation, education innovation, even patents. So it was very detailed, and the big difference was that it was a combination of economic and social targets. I remember very well what you said about the social investment. There was a very interesting study from a Dutch university, according to which it is interesting to study the cost of not investing in social sector. And the cost is huge when you don't invest in social sector. I think that it's interesting to ask ourselves and to see why there is not even one successful country in the targets we had put to ourselves in 1999. In 2003, the vast majority were right-wing governments, and then a new era started in Europe. And then all targets were purely economic. In 2005, there was a change in the Lisbon agreements and then the commitments, and then it was the economic democracy. It was everything was at an economic level. All indicators were about economic issues, and they agreed that they are not going at the European level to measure these social indicators. I think that it's interesting to keep it in mind, because sometimes there are so clear differences between the Social Democrats and the right-wing parties.
We've got about 10 more minutes, so I'll take some more comments from the floor. Please introduce yourself again.
Maria Rodriguez, policy advisor close to European institutions. My question to the panel is the following. I'm assuming that Social Democrats are confronted with a new difficulty to implement their agenda. This is the particular combination between a kind of financial-driven capitalism and high public debt. This combination can be found now in many European countries, in the United States, and in some other countries of the world. And the fundamental implication of this is that our democratic choices are reduced. Our possibility of democratic choice is much reduced because of this pressure. And because of that, I think we should also discuss the kind of state we need to deal with this new kind of pressure. Financial-driven capitalism plus high public debt. So my question to the panel is, what can you say about what kind of state do you need in the future to overcome this pressure and to open again the possibility for democratic choices?
If we can have the mic up in the front.
We're on to the hard questions.
Hello, Wolfgang Schmidt from the city of Hamburg, where we just 3 months ago won a 50% majority for the SPD, which is good news, so it can be achieved, I guess. 2 short remarks. I think it was very important what you said, Job, on concentrating also on the middle-level education jobs, because I think we tend also, in the context of the Lisbon agenda, to concentrate on the 40% goal of having 40% of one of each generation entering university. We tend to forget about the 60 other percent that are not entering university, and I think we should address their problems as well. In Germany, which is perceived as the country of the poets and thinkers, we have around 10% of all the population with university education. So that makes clear why it's such an important thing also for our electorate. The second remark is also, and we discussed in the morning, the question of tax cuts, and I think there are 2 ways to increase income. One, of course, is tax cuts. The other one is increasing salaries and wages. And this is also a thing, we do know this has to be done by business and in negotiation with trade unions, but this is an issue we should talk about at least, because then our electorate also understands that we are on their side.
Go ahead.
Frans Becker of the Viardi Beckman Foundation, Amsterdam. I'd have a question for Will Hutton. His story is a little bit of a fairy tale. If capitalism as a Cinderella gets the right shoe, it's all right. We've got good capitalism. But one of our challenges, I think, is not only getting good capitalism. For parts of the economy or of the services or society, we have a direct responsibility as political groups or parties. This is what the Swedish party leader addressed in his public services and public sector intervention, and I fully agree with him. We are in charge, if you want, for large sectors of the economy in the public sector, and at least partly in Holland, we blew it. And this has nothing to do with capitalism, but this simply has to do with a complete lack of creativity, imagination, etc. on our part.
Okay, we'll take one more back here.
Lodewijk Asscher, I used to work under Mayor Cohen in Amsterdam. Very short question. I think that public anger is not only directed towards the bonuses for bankers, but also towards the benefits which people feel are handed out to immigrants. And that's threatening solidarity in Europe. Look at what's happening with North African refugees nowadays. And it's a question that hasn't been addressed by the panel or today. And I think if we are to provide real answers, even if we are much better in regulating bonuses for bankers, we have to come up with something better than what I've heard today.
Okay, I'm going to close it off and let people react. But Helle Thorning-Schmidt was supposed to be on this panel, relevant to the last comment. I understand that Denmark closed its borders today, probably in anticipation of calling elections, and suspended the Schengen Agreement in Denmark. So Helle has her hands full in responding to that, but maybe we've got a range of comments and suggestions, and I'll give everybody the final word. We'll start with any reactions. Why don't I start with you, Håkan? We'll just come down the list.
No, I do not think so. I think everything has been said, not everything, but this panel. No, I will not come up. Of course, the final remarks that we must do better than what we have presented today is of course true. Otherwise, we would have been in government, all of us. So you're absolutely correct. So I will return back to Stockholm and do my homework and then come back to your next meeting. So that's my final remark.
Yep.
Well, I think I cannot answer the same question to Lodewijk Asscher, but I think he has a point. And I think that one of the things, what in the last decade we didn't well was exactly this part. Working and handling with migrants in a way as we did, and which indeed gave anger to a lot of people who thought that migrants were handled better than they were. So we have to react on that, and I think that we have to do that in a double way. And the first one is that we should realize that migrants coming to our countries, that they have to come into our society and being in our society gradually become members of our society and gradually getting rights in our society. Not immediately, but getting the rights. That's one. And the second one, and I think that will be more important in the years to come, and especially if when you look at what's going on in all the countries in the Middle East, I think that it's also not only our duty, but also very important for ourselves that we help, not organize by ourselves, but we help to organize work in those countries, because that's the best way to organize it in a way that people stay there and getting the same benefits as we are used to in our countries. and looking to all those differences which we have in our countries, all the richness, with the richness, we can talk about all the different difficulties which we have here, but still we are very rich. And looking to those countries, we also have to organize it in a way that the same kind of fairness which we have will also be in those countries. So I think that's a double answer that we have to do that. And talking then about the question whether the democratic choices are reduced, well, that may be the case. But nevertheless, we have a choice. And our choices are different than the choices which are made now by all those other governments. Ask all of us what the choices are, and you will see that those choices are very different from those made by the governments, the right-wing governments at the moment.
Ed?
Let me just briefly respond to a couple of the questions. On the public sector, I think a very good point was made, and it is true in Britain as well, which is about the way the public sector was run from the point of view of the citizen, but also from the point of view of the person working in the public sector, and both sort of equal issues for us, equally important issues for us in the future. Just on this question about middle-level jobs, I think one lesson for us from the Scandinavian economies is that we have a formal economy and we have a family economy. The family economy in childcare, in elderly care. And actually, at least in Britain, and I think maybe a bit in the United States, the family economy is treated as a sort of a kind of thing on the side and isn't taken as seriously in terms of progression, qualifications, what is it like to work in the family economy, and all of those things. And actually, everything we know is the family economy is going to be much more important in the future, and a lot of these non-university jobs will come from that economy. So that's a very, very important thing for us, as well as the more general point about people who don't go to university. Just to end on this point about immigration, I think is good that you raised it. Important. Let me just say something about the British experience. Because immigration was a big issue at the last election for us and remains a big issue. It's actually more about Eastern European immigration. I saw it in my own constituency, my district that I represent. In the end, it comes down to this, which is, should mean that we have a social democratic response. Immigration is a class issue. It's a class issue because it affects different people differently. It affects different people differently in its economic effects, its social effects across the range. If you're somebody who wants a Polish builder in London, it's good news that there are more Polish builders. If you are a builder, you might have thought it's not such good news. Now, what does that mean for us? It doesn't mean you can go back, in my view, on free movement of labour within the 27 countries of the European Union. There are issues about the transition and all of that, which are big and important issues. But I think it does go to this economic strategy. And it does go to, what is happening to people's wages, what protections do you offer? And the complexity of this question is you're facing tension from both ends. You're facing globalization, which is making the margins and the competition in your economy far greater, and therefore the worries about regulation greater. But then you're facing this pressure from the other end, which is, look, if you're expanding your low-paid labor force, you're not going to be able to maintain an open economy unless you increase protections for people, or at least give people a sense of protections. And the lesson I learned from our experience is that we were too slow to recognize that at the very least, there are other issues to do with immigration, but at least on that issue, the importance of maintaining some of those protections for people and making clear they will be maintained.
I'm getting the high sign, so Anna, you get the final word. Thank you. All right, I'll give you one word, Will. You go first, and then we'll let Anna have a word.
He's never said one word in his life.
There's been one or two questions directed at me, and I really want to answer them, and it won't take seconds. Look, on this question of immigration, please look at the article I wrote in the memos to the left. I strongly take the view that fairness is about, as I said, do you desert, you pay in, you get out. It's a relationship between effort and contribution. The reason why so many working class people across Europe resent immigration is because they believe the immigrant has not paid in and is getting their desserts without making the contribution. You have to detoxify that, in my view, by moving towards earned citizenship. It's a tough thing for the left to hear, but I put it in the paper. I didn't have a chance to say so. I think it's an important thing to say. To the question about public services, my view is that one of the reasons why, and I share the view of Paul Donahue, who's written a really important book, professor at the Kennedy School, called The Warping of Government Work. It's called The Warping of Government Work. Do glance at it. His view is the reason why the productivity of US public services, and the same is true of European public services, is that actually there's been too little, in my language, in the language I use, there's been too little attempt to have performance, to get due deserts for good rewards in the public sector for those who do it. If you like, there's been too much of Kevin Dugan's, to pick up the point he made, there's been too much of Kevin Dugan's kind of egalitarianism, if you like, within the provision of public services, and not enough good capitalism. There's been not enough recognition that if you want well-led public services, you've got to pay the people who lead them, you've got to penalize them if they screw it up and reward them if they do well. And a performance orientation in public sector delivery is really important to revalidating and relegitimizing them. One of the points I'm so passionate about it in my report. On workplace democracy, look, I mean, I made the point, I couldn't have made it clearer, I think, that actually fairness process is about workplace representation. One of the dimensions of it is workplace representation. And it's why, as Miliband said, I recommend that actually when you set these targets for performance in the public sector, introducing good capitalism, there should be members of the trade union movement sitting on the remuneration committees, setting the targets that we expect the public sector managers to deliver, for which they will be well rewarded if they do, and they will suffer some penalty if they don't. It's a fundamental point, but it's actually trying to marry workplace democracy, good capitalism, and public service delivery. And to Kevin Dugan, I would say, is that on this question of is there good and bad fairness, you misunderstand the point completely. The fairness is, the way I try to define it, is that it's about do you desert, it's about proportionality, it's about brute good luck and brute bad luck, and it's about process. And all the examples that you gave, attempting to tell me that I got it wrong, I could easily go one by one if there were time to demonstrate that within the framework I've got, I can rebut your critique. Some equality, by the way, and don't get my fundamental point is I am in favor of equity. I think that we've got to be jolly careful on the left about the way working class people and actually our electorates think about inequality, deserved inequality that are not unhappy to go along with. In the UK, we paid the headmaster of a primary school £220,000. Everyone said he's been paid half as much again as the Prime Minister, and the reflex reaction for many on the British left was, it's colossally unfair. In fact, no citizen, no parent who sent their kid to that school was prepared to say that that pay was unfair. Why? Because the headmaster had deserved his money, because the turnaround of the school was dramatic. It was deserved inequality. What makes them so angry and upset and visceral is unearned inequality, the rentier, the disproportionate gainers in our society. We should direct our anger at them. If you don't get it, you haven't understood a word I've said. I feel quite strongly about it. Thank you.
Thanks. Anna, you get a last word.
Two points. As far as the public debt is concerned, and democracy and public debt, in order to have democracy, you must have an independent country. And I would like just to say as a title, because it's a big discussion, that a huge public debt, I think that creates problems of independence and sovereignty of a country. And my second point concerns the immigration issue. I think that it is difficult to have general definitions or to agree on policies because things are very different from country to country. It is different to speak or to analyze immigration in Norway, which is in the corner of Northern Europe, and they can control and have a very concrete policy concerning immigration, and it's totally different to speak for immigration in Greece, when we have 120,000 immigrants per year who are coming from Turkey. And each small battle in Afghanistan comes to an end in Greece, and where there are hundreds of small islands that cannot be all controlled, and there are this huge number of people who are coming not to stay in Greece, but to go in Europe. And because of Dublin and of the agreements we have, it is impossible to move from Greece. So they are stuck there. So is it a class problem? No, it is not. It is a very complicated problem which has to do with foreign policy, which have to do with what happens in the world, which is a social one, a national one, a class one. It's a very complicated, and we cannot have a very simple answer. Thank you.
All right, great. Well, drinks at 20:30 outside this room, dinner at 2100 inside this room. Please join me in thanking a terrific panel.